The world is watching a nuclear question with no clear answer, and the silence from the inspectors is louder than any explosion. For months, the International Atomic Energy Agency has been unable to enter Iran's declared enrichment facilities. The cameras are dark, the seals are broken, the data streams have gone cold. And in that void of information, one number keeps echoing to diplomatic corridors and defense ministries across the globe: 440.9 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. That was the last verified figure before the war began. It is enough, if further enriched, to produce approximately 10 nuclear weapons. But what has happened since then is anyone's guess, and that uncertainty is precisely what makes this moment so dangerous. To understand why this matters, we need to step back and look at how we got here. For years, Iran steadily expanded its nuclear program under the watchful eyes of international inspectors. The 2015 nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, had placed strict limits on Iran's enrichment activities and granted unprecedented access to inspectors. But after the United States withdrew from the agreement in 2018 and reimposed crippling sanctions, Iran began gradually reducing its compliance. Centrifuges that had been mothballed were brought back online. Enrichment levels that had been capped at 3.67% crept upward, first to 20%, then to 60%. Each step was carefully calibrated, each escalation publicly announced, each move designed to pressure the international community while staying just below the threshold that might trigger military action. That delicate balance shattered on February 28, 2026. In a coordinated operation, the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran's nuclear infrastructure, military bases, and key command centers. The stated goal was to degrade Iran's ability to produce weapons-grade material and to eliminate what both countries described as an imminent threat. The strikes were devastating. Facilities at Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, and other sites were hit with precision munitions. Iranian air defenses, though formidable, were overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of the attack. Within days, Iran retaliated with missile barrages targeting Israeli cities and American bases across the region. The war that followed lasted roughly 5 weeks and cost thousands of lives before a fragile ceasefire was brokered in early April. But here is where the story takes its most unsettling turn. When the bomb stopped falling and the diplomats began talking, the inspectors did not return. The IAEA, which had maintained a continuous presence in Iran for years, found itself locked out. The 4 declared enrichment facilities, the Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan, and the Tehran research reactor, became black boxes. The specialized monitoring equipment installed at great cost and effort was damaged, disabled, or simply left unattended. The agency's Director General has since reported to the United Nations Security Council that the organization has had no access to these sites since the conflict began, and the situation remains unresolved. This is not a minor bureaucratic inconvenience. It is a fundamental breakdown of the global non-proliferation regime. For decades, the international community has relied on a simple but powerful principle: transparency prevents catastrophe. When inspectors can see what is happening inside a country's nuclear facilities, when they can measure stockpiles, count centrifuges, and verify declarations, the risk of secret weapons programs is dramatically reduced. That transparency creates trust, or at least enough trust to avoid preemptive military action. When it disappears, so does the foundation for stable deterrence. Consider what we do not know. We do not know whether the strikes destroyed Iran's existing stockpile of 60% enriched uranium, or whether some or all of it survived. We do not know whether Iran has continued enrichment activities in the months since the war, perhaps at hidden or undeclared sites that were not targeted. We do not know whether the country has moved closer to weapons-grade enrichment, the 90% threshold that transforms a civilian program into a military one. We do not know whether components for a nuclear device, which require different expertise and facilities than enrichment alone, have been assembled in secret. Every one of these questions is answerable in theory, but none are answerable in practice because no one has been inside the facilities to look. The implications ripple outward in concentric circles. The first circle is regional. Israel, which has long viewed an Iranian nuclear weapon as an existential threat, now faces the possibility that its military campaign, however destructive, may have only delayed rather than eliminated the danger. Israeli defense planners must operate in an environment of radical uncertainty, where the timeline for Iranian breakout, the period needed to produce a workable weapon, could be months or could be years. That uncertainty increases the pressure for preemptive action, which in turn increases the risk of renewed conflict. It is a cycle that feeds on itself. The second circle is the broader Middle East. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and other regional powers have watched the IAEA's exclusion with deep concern. These countries have their own security calculations to make, and the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran, or even an Iran that is simply too close to nuclear capability for comfort, is already driving strategic realignments. Saudi Arabia has made no secret of its interest in developing its own civilian nuclear program, with the implicit understanding that it wants the same technological capabilities that Iran possesses. The risk of a regional nuclear arms race, long a theoretical concern, is now a live possibility that could reshape the security architecture of the entire Middle East. The third circle is global. The United States, which led the 2026 strikes alongside Israel, now faces a difficult strategic position. Washington must balance its commitment to Israeli security with the need to prevent a wider war, manage relations with European allies who have been skeptical of military action, and respond to domestic political pressures that cut across party lines. The Biden administration's approach, which emphasized diplomacy and the restoration of the nuclear deal, was overtaken by events. The Trump administration's more confrontational stance led directly to the 2026 conflict. Whatever comes next, American policymakers will be operating with the same intelligence gaps that plague everyone else, and that makes calibrated decision-making extraordinarily difficult. Russia and China, meanwhile, have their own interests in play. Both countries have condemned the strikes and called for a return to diplomatic engagement. But their motivations are complex. Russia, bogged down in Ukraine and facing economic strain, has little appetite for another major confrontation but sees Iran as a useful partner in challenging American influence. China, as the world's largest energy importer, is deeply concerned about stability in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of global oil flows. Beijing has pursued a careful policy of maintaining economic ties with Iran while avoiding entanglement in the conflict. But if the nuclear question remains unresolved, both Moscow and Beijing will face increasing pressure to take sides, and their choices will shape the international response. The economic dimension cannot be ignored. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's petroleum passes, has been a recurring flashpoint. Iranian threats to close the strait, whether credible or not, have sent energy markets into spasms of volatility. Even the possibility of renewed conflict drives up insurance costs for shipping, disrupts supply chains, and creates uncertainty that affects everything from gasoline prices to industrial production. In an already fragile global economy, the last thing anyone needs is an oil shock triggered by a nuclear crisis that could have been prevented with proper verification. So what happens now? The diplomatic picture is murky at best. Talks have taken place in Geneva and Islamabad, with envoys shuttling between capitals and back-channel communications, continuing even when public statements are hostile. The core challenge is finding a formula that addresses Iran's security concerns, Israel's existential fears, and the international community's demand for transparency. Some analysts have proposed a revised inspection regime, perhaps with broader access than the original nuclear deal allowed as the price for sanctions relief and security guarantees. Others argue that the time for such arrangements has passed and that only sustained military pressure can prevent Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold. The problem with the military option is that it has already been tried, and its limitations are now plain to see. The 2026 strikes were among the most sophisticated and destructive ever launched against a nuclear program. They set Iran back, perhaps significantly, but they did not eliminate the program. They did not provide lasting verification, and they did not resolve the underlying political conflicts that drive Iran's nuclear ambitions. If anything, the strikes may have hardened Iranian resolve and convinced the leadership that a nuclear deterrent is the only reliable guarantee of regime survival. This is the paradox at the heart of the current crisis. The more the international community tries to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons through pressure and isolation, the more Iran is incentivized to pursue them. The more Iran pursues them, the more its neighbors and adversaries feel threatened, and the more likely preventive military action becomes. Each cycle of escalation deepens the cycle, and the absence of inspectors only accelerates the spin. There is also the question of what Iran itself wants. The Iranian leadership is not monolithic. Hardliners have long argued that a nuclear weapon is essential for national security and regional dominance. More pragmatic figures have suggested that a verifiable civilian program, with robust inspections and clear limits, could satisfy Iran's energy needs and scientific ambitions, while avoiding the crippling costs of sanctions and isolation. The war and its aftermath have strengthened the hardliners' hand, but they have also exposed the vulnerabilities of a strategy built on confrontation. The Iranian economy is in ruins, the population is restive, and the military, though still formidable, has suffered significant losses. A nuclear program that cannot be protected is not much of a deterrent. The protesters who filled Iranian streets in January 2026 and who were met with brutal repression represent another variable in this equation. Their grievances were economic and political, not primarily about nuclear policy, but their existence reminds us that regimes facing internal pressure often make rash decisions abroad. The temptation to rally nationalist sentiment around a nuclear achievement or to divert attention from domestic failures with foreign confrontation is a well-worn playbook. It is also a dangerous one because it can lead to miscalculations that spiral beyond anyone's control. For the international community, the priority must be restoring some form of verification. This will not be easy. Iran has legitimate security concerns after being attacked, and any new inspection regime will need to address those concerns while maintaining the rigor that makes inspections meaningful. That may require creative diplomacy, perhaps involving neutral third parties, regional security arrangements, or phased implementation that builds confidence over time. It will certainly require patience, persistence, and a willingness to compromise on all sides. The alternative is to accept a world in which Iran's nuclear program operates without oversight, in which estimates and assumptions replace verified facts, and in which the decision to launch another war may be based on incomplete or incorrect intelligence. We have been down that road before, and it does not end well. In the end, the question is not whether Iran can build a nuclear weapon. Given enough time and determination, any country with sufficient industrial and scientific capacity can do so. The question is whether the international community can create conditions in which Iran chooses not to, and in which the rest of the world can be confident that choice is being honored. That confidence requires verification. Verification requires access. And access, right now, is what we do not have, 440.9 kilograms. It is a number that should haunt every diplomat, every defense planner, and every citizen who understands what is at stake. Because until the inspectors return, until the cameras come back online, and until the seals are restored, we are all flying blind to the most dangerous airspace on Earth. And in that darkness, the distance between stability and catastrophe may be far shorter than anyone wants to admit.